Ladies and gentlemen, my name is John O'Sullivan. I'm the president of the Danube Institute. I'm delighted to welcome you here for what I think will be a fascinating discussion and even debate between our two principal guests, and also, of course, at a later stage involving you as well, because one of the elements of the conversations we have here are that they broaden to extend everybody in the room. But, of course, that depends in large measure on the success, which I am confident, in which our original speakers have in stimulating you and drawing you into the conversation. I think we're very fortunate to have two distinguished, lively, and brilliant speakers to begin and continue the discussion, and two people who are capable, as they have shown in different ways, of discussing the two elements in the conversation. Those two elements are politics and religion. Now, it seems to me that as an occasional participant in such discussions, that when we talk about politics and religion, we are generally discussing the way in which political issues, so to speak, intrude into religion and become topics in which people in different religious groups debate with each other and discuss political questions. The impulse is, in a sense, political more than it is religious, even when religious opinions are seriously advanced and discussed. But there's also the way in which religion influences politics, and that goes very deep. It goes very deep in the sense that the development of Western society in recent years has gone in the direction since Max Weber, and I'm not going to tell you what the theses of our two speakers are, I'll leave that to them, but in recent years we have moved from a world in which religious and symbolic and supernatural, it's fair to say, considerations and ways of thinking about things have retreated before a secular, scientific, or in some cases, scientistic way of approaching our lives and our common interests. We are dealing with both today, but as the title of the discussion today tells us, it is principally this second aspect of how religion and politics mix, which is going to attract at least our initial attention. And that topic is the danger and falsehood of the Disenchantment project. What is the Disenchantment project? I'm going to leave that to the two speakers to unveil. The second thing I want to say is that the two speakers, of course, in their writings, and primarily they are writers, journalists, too, have had their lives as writers have been very much concerned with these religious mixture of religion and politics. Obviously, we have here as our colleague Rod Dreher. Rod is is now permanently with the Danube Institute, and he is exploring in myriad ways how religion and politics mix, combine, separate, and so on. And, of course, events like this taking place in large part because he's now a permanent member of our community, and we're delighted that he's here again today. Now, Greg Sheridan, our guest, who's a visiting fellow at the Institute, is a distinguished journalist and writer in Australia. He is, in fact, the foreign editor of The Australian, which is the only true Australian national newspaper. He has been the foreign editor for, I would say, almost exactly one half of the newspaper's existence, since it was founded in the mid-60s. And he is very well known in Australia and abroad. I lived in Australia for some years, and I can give first-hand testimony here. He's very well known as one of the most influential commentators on foreign policy and international relations. He has interviewed almost every president, prime minister, prominent politician in Australasia and in Asia. And we're delighted that I'm sure that is going to emerge in the conversations, even though it's ancillary to the main topic. In addition to his work as a journalist, however, Mr. Sheridan is also an author. His books, which there are 3, include a memoir entitled When We Were Young and Foolish. And on the cover of it are 3 politicians who he was at school or university with, and they cover the range of all the political parties in Australia. Robert Carr, the former Prime Minister of New South Wales, Kevin Rudd, the former Labour federal Prime Minister. I forget the third, but I know in addition, Tony Abbott, the former Conservative, 2 former Conservative federal Prime Ministers, Tony Abbott and Malcolm Turnbull, are among that. So there is a lot we might draw him into discussing about the development of the relationship between church and state in Australia, which I think is fascinating and has a great deal to is an important element in 20th century history of communism and freedom. He is, however, also devoted. He's also devoted some time to looking at religion from a more personal and less political route. And so I think we have 2 people with the right backgrounds to raise these questions and discuss them. I'm asking Greg if he would open the discussion. I'm asking Rod if he would then respond, and then we'll explore among ourselves all the questions they raise. Thank you.
Well, John, Melissa, ladies and gentlemen, thanks very much, John, for that kind introduction. What an honour it is to be with you today. What an honour it is to share a platform with John O'Sullivan and Rod Dreher, 2 men I admire enormously, and to be hosted by John and Melissa O'Sullivan, the power couple of Central European intellectual life, who have reconstructed not so much the Austro-Hungarian Empire as the Liverpool, Alabama Hungarian Empire, which, you know, is a distinctive ethnic amalgam, really. But as my beloved wife, Jacy, will attest, anyone who can marry a working-class Irish Catholic will get a lot of time off in purgatory. And having introduced Jacy, I'd like to say to you, if there's something you find particularly objectionable about tonight's address, please take it up with her, because she'll sort it all out for you. And my final preliminary observation is that I'm reminded of a circumstance like this in which Adlai Stevenson found himself once. For the next 25 or 30 minutes, it's my job to talk. It's your job to listen. If you should happen to finish your job before I finish my job, no hard feelings whatsoever. Max Weber declared that the fate of our times is characterised above all by the disenchantment of the world. Now, we'll come back directly to disenchantment and what that means for the world. I'm not going to make this address overly autobiographical, but I will digress just briefly to explain why I am now so preoccupied with this issue and how I got to this intellectual approach. I've been a journalist for 45 years, and pretty soon I guess I'll have to make a career decision about whether this is my long-term vocation or not. But in that time, I've seen the ambient culture in Australia and in the whole of the West really go from being nominally pro-Christian when I started in journalism, perhaps Christianity honoured in the breach, but nonetheless the culture was nominally pro-Christian, to being kind of neutral, to now being actively, energetically anti-Christian. That's certainly the case in Australia. I think it's really the case in a lot of Europe and even in parts of the United States. And so, of course, as you get a bit older, you realise that you're soon going to have a conversation with your maker, and if you've lived a life of journalism, there's a lot to make up for, you know, and so I started to speak out a bit more in favour of Christianity. Also, I think if history, circumstance gives you a microphone, it's a bit cowardly not to use it when your friends are under attack. And of course, once I got into this, I realised that Christianity is very good for journalists, because journalism, after all, is a lifelong search for the truth and for a great story and for dramatic material. And nothing could better satisfy those criteria than the Christian story. Nonetheless, a strange thing for a foreign editor to do. My day job is involved with worrying about Chinese military manoeuvres in the South China Sea and Donald Trump. I know some of you love Donald Trump, some of you don't like him very much. I found as a foreign editor that I wanted to sue the United Nations to give me a human right mandated days where I just didn't have to think about him at all. And I think that's maybe one reason why I started to go into writing books about Christianity. I'm afraid writing books is very addictive. I've written 8 books now, and it's a lot like heroin, really. It's better if you don't start, but once you start, you can't stop. It's the nearest, I think, a man ever gets to the dramatic experience that a woman has of childbirth. There's a very nice moment of conception, a long, very awkward, increasingly uncomfortable gestation, an agonising moment of delivery, and then your first thought is, well, I'm never going to do that again. And then you see the little fella and he's quite clever and he's running around and you think, well, you know, that's fun. I might like another one of those. However, to return to our topic, I did come to the view that there is a political crisis in my country and throughout the West, and that this is really a cultural crisis. It proceeds from a cultural crisis. So to change politics, you had to change the culture. But the cultural crisis itself, in my view, proceeded from the decline of religious belief and practice. So, in someone else's phrase, much wiser than me, politics is downstream of culture, but culture itself, in my view, is downstream of faith. Now, most of my books, 5 of my 8 books, have been about foreign affairs, conventional things for a foreign editor to write about. But and then I wrote a memoir, and then I've written 2 books about Christianity. And after I had written these 2 books about Christianity, I realised that they were a 2-part answer on my part to the great cultural project in the West over the last several hundred years, which has been disenchantment. Western elites over the last few hundred years have been mostly consciously engaged in a project of disenchanting the culture. Now, in Weber's terms, disenchantment is about the Enlightenment and then science deauthorising religion, delegitimising religious interpretation of life, attacking the plausibility of a religious explanation. Disenchantment reduces society, in my view, to a kind of primitive pagan materialism. So you might say, how can we be pagan today? We don't believe in gods like the old pagans did. We now believe in nothing. That's not quite true. I think rather modern man gives life to Chesterton's observation that when you cease to believe in Christianity, you don't believe in nothing, you believe in anything. And of course, we worship, like the old pagans did, the gods of power and sex and money, just under different names. Disenchantment atomises society. It robs us of the integrating power of a single religious interpretation of life. It robs us of transcendent meaning in our lives. So in answer to the question of why am I here, what does my life mean, the answer of disenchantment is it means nothing. There is no reason why you are here. You are just a chancy outcrop of the biosphere. Now let's pause to note, by the way, that this is a strange cul-de-sac, a strange dead end for the West to have travelled down. No other culture in the world has travelled down this particular dead end. It's very eccentric, both in terms of the contemporary world and in terms of the history of mankind. The vast majority of human beings who have ever lived have believed in and had a relationship with God. The vast majority of human beings who are alive today, anywhere on the planet, believe in God and have a relationship with God. Only in the West is this strange new atheism predominant. There is, of course, a paradox inherent in Christianity, which is that it is a universal religion. It is open to every human being on the planet. And the vast majority of Christians today are not Westerners or do not live in the West. They live in Africa and Asia and Latin America. I suppose you can say Latin America is the West. And Christianity, like other world religions, is on fire outside the West. It's the only social force that the Chinese government cannot control. The growth of Christianity in China under communism, one of the astonishing stories of the 20th century. And the rest of the world is consciously religious. So my life as a foreign editor has been predominantly spent in Asia. And let me give you 3 examples from Asia. China, notionally an atheist state, but Marxism-Leninism, Mao Zedong thought, I think, is best seen as a religious system, which provides its own comprehensive existential explanation for life, existential purpose, has a deep theology, deep scripturalism, has its own metaphysics. They're pretty dusty, but nonetheless they answer the questions of who am I and why am I here? Who are you? You're a Chinese. You exist to serve the interests of the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese state and to complete the proletarian revolution. And the Chinese Communist Party sees its purpose as giving meaning to the lives of Chinese people. Indonesia, where I spend a lot of time, it's inconceivable you could go to a book festival or a writers' festival in Indonesia and no one would mention Islam. Yet when I wrote this memoir that John was kind enough to reference, When We Were Young and Foolish, I went to a lot of book festivals all over Australia and there was not a single book that was pro-Christian or pro-Jewish out of the hundreds and hundreds of books that were being discussed and were being promoted. You know, I spent a lot of time in Indonesia and you often have to fill out a form which asks you what religion you are. There is no box which says no religion or atheist. Indonesians find that kind of inconceivable. I had that experience once when interviewing Pope Tawadros of the Coptic Church. He spoke pretty good English and I was interviewing him and I said to him, "Now, Your Holiness, has atheism ever appealed to you?" He said, "What did you say? Could you just say that again?" I said, not believing. Have you ever been tempted by unbelief?" He said, "I'm sorry, I don't quite understand what you're saying. Could you just say..." And we went through this 4 or 5 times and finally turned to a friend, a local Coptic man who they had an exchange in Arabic or perhaps in Coptic. And finally, Pope Tawadros understood what I was asking and he looked at me with that unmistakable quality in his eyes which said, "God, they're weird people, these Australians, aren't they?" And he said, "No, I've never been tempted by this strange, weird, exotic, bizarre thing that you've just mentioned." And of course, in India, we see a Hindu revival. So I mention this just to say the Western wrong turn we've just taken in the last couple of 100 years, but accelerated in the last 20 or 30 years, is very weird in human experience, very unrepresentative of human experience. And indeed, if the West is so evil and everyone else is so good, perhaps we should reflect on the evil of this choice. But back to Disenchantment. The first of my Christian books, God is Good for You, defended the idea of God, and the second, which was called Christians, the Urgent Case for Jesus in Our World, defended the New Testament. Now, the whole of the Disenchantment project rests on 2 propositions which intellectually are incredibly weak and flimsy. These propositions are not the reason people no longer believe in Christianity, but they underpin this lack of belief or this active rejection of Christianity. So these 2 propositions are, the first is that God is dead, that science has pronounced against God. So for my sins, for God is Good for You, I read all the New Atheists. I'd never been tempted to do that before. It was a very sound choice I'd made previously, but I read through Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and so on. What a dreary bunch of rubbish it all was, you know. I was astonished at the flimsy, shallow, worthless nature of these arguments. Like, I'd been a little scared of reading them, thinking they might say something which makes me really question my own beliefs, but I just couldn't believe how fraudulent they were. What they were doing really was just rehashing the old 19th century arguments against God, which the culture had forgotten. Because the culture no longer debated God, it had forgotten these old arguments. And then it would put some of these arguments next to some irrelevant science. So, for example, Dawkins argues at one point that because the universe is 14 billion years old, that proves that God couldn't have created it, because why would he waste his time spending 14 billion years? To which you think, well, how do you know, Dawkins, what God would do? I mean, God's idea of generosity might be different from yours. It strikes me as absolutely characteristic of God that he would spend 14 billion years preparing this beautiful garden for us. And then, of course, every real consideration of atheism has to have the idea that there's intelligent life all over the universe. But I tell you what, if you're making your decisions on the basis of evidence, you'd have to say it's been a long time that they haven't called round. You know, they really, there is no evidence at all that there is any intelligent life in the universe beyond the earth. Not that that would challenge faith if there were, but there's no evidence for it at all. And much of this new atheism involves magical thinking far beyond anything that Christianity involves. So, for example, the new atheists have to deal with the extreme improbability of human life. It is like winning a lottery 1 billion times in a row. It's so extraordinarily unlikely. You know, the Big Bang had to be just right, otherwise the planets would have dissipated too quickly or they would have fallen back in on themselves. Carbon is essential to life, but the development of carbon is very eccentric, and you know, the physical properties of the universe had to be just so and so on, what they call the Goldilocks universe. So Stephen Hawkins deals with this unlikelihood by proposing that there are an infinite number of universes, and we just lucked into the one that is suitable for life. But where does he get an infinite number of universes? This is just magical thinking designed to overcome a logical problem in the atheist faith. So I came to the view that atheism really is just another kind of religious faith, but very, very implausible. The reason this is moderately important even now, the argument is not mainly carried out on these rational grounds, but the consensus of our time rests on these two propositions, and both these propositions are easily falsifiable. And of course, the new atheists completely deny the power of human testimony. Roger Scruton's beautiful book, The Soul of the Universe, argues that the most powerful evidence for the existence of God is the long human experience of God. And indeed, in a courtroom, you're always trying to prove things by calling human testimony. But the new atheists rule all religious testimony as simply out of bounds, which is, of course, anti-rational. My second book, Christians, was about Jesus and his first friends, and its intention, its innovation, was to read the New Testament primarily as a journalist. So, yes, I'm a believing Christian, but I approached the New Testament as a journalist, looking for credibility, for narrative, for sources, for overall meaning. I wasn't looking for sources in a deep biblical studies, philological context, but you know, if Mark tells you all these great scoops, not Mark, Luke rather gives you all these great scoops about Mary, it's pretty obvious that his source was Mary. You know, you read all the Bob Woodward books about Washington politics, and Bob Woodward tells you what the CIA director was thinking as he woke up in the morning, what he had for breakfast, what he said to his wife, what he was dreaming about the night before, the phone call he made when he got into his car. It's not very hard to work out that probably the CIA director was Bob Woodward's source, you know. And the New Testament is full of obvious sources like that. And the New Testament, like the Old Testament, is great fun, and it's not read enough as a single narrative. Christians, atheists have bits of it that they trot out to show how wicked it is. Christians tend to read it verse by verse, looking for deep theological meaning, which is a perfectly good thing to do. It's not read enough, in my view, just as a narrative, a book at a time. The longest book is only 30 or 40 pages. You're not going to die of old age while you read it. And it's compelling. It's absolutely compelling, and it certainly has the ring of truth. And it's full of vividly human characters, Paul, Mary Magdalene, and so on. But the Disenchantment project rests on completely discrediting everything about the New Testament, especially its historicity, saying that everything in the New Testament is completely bogus and fake. It was written decades or hundreds of years after the time it claims to have been written, and made up by church hierarchs for theological and church power purposes. And this is the consensus of our time. You see it in schlock nonsense like the Da Vinci Code. Everything holds that the New Testament is phony. The last thing it is a historical record. But in fact, in holding this, contemporary culture is tremendously out of date with scholarship. Scholarship has swung back tremendously to validating the broad historicity of the New Testament. Now, you cannot, through scholarship, establish the truth, finally, of the miracles, but you can certainly establish that Jesus was a real person. He lived at the time that the Gospels describe, that he was crucified under Pontius Pilate, that the early Christian community believed that he had risen from the dead from the very first, and that the scriptures are near contemporaneous. And I won't give you many examples, but just a couple of examples of the way scholarship has changed. 20 or 30 years ago, there had been no archaeological discovery of synagogues in the Galilee from the time of Jesus. So, certain brand of scholars would say this shows that the Gospels were really written much later, after the destruction of the Jewish temple in Jerusalem, when it was common for Jews to have synagogues. But before then, all the Jews in the Galilee used to go to Jerusalem for the big feasts, so they didn't have neighbourhood synagogues. This is clearly an anachronism in the Gospel and shows that the Gospels were written decades or much further later, and they were retrofitting their own reality back to that time. Very nice theory until we started discovering the ruins of synagogues from the time of Jesus. First one, then another. Now I think there have been 4 or 5 discovered by Israeli archaeological authorities, not pro-Christian or anything. They do archaeological digs when they have to develop, when they're going to develop a new hotel or something. They make sure there are no important historical sites. And now we've discovered, I think, 5 or 6 synagogues in the Galilee which are incontrovertibly from the time of Jesus. So it turns out all that scholarship was junk and the Gospels were right on that one small matter. That doesn't prove the Gospels are generally true, but one of the reasons for doubting them, their broad historicity, is removed. Then another marvellous enterprise of the Israeli authorities has been a project to establish the use of Jewish names over the ages. So this is a new resource we've only had for a couple of decades. And they established that the Jewish names used in the New Testament are perfectly representative of the Jewish names used in Jewish communities at that time. Now, again, how could you possibly retrofit that if you'd written the Gospels 100 years hence? You know, if I was writing a story today about historic Australia 250 years ago, I might name characters Brett and Todd and Shane and Tarquin, and, you know, you'd be able to work out that I didn't know what I was talking about. But in fact, the Gospels turn out to be absolutely accurate. The Gospels and the epistles taken together in their use of Jewish names. The Dead Sea Scrolls show us that the Jewish life that the New Testament describes is accurate. That was Jewish life in the Holy Land at that time. The disputes over who you could eat with, whether you should rescue an animal from falls down the well on the Sabbath, all the sorts of things which figure in the Gospels actually were representative. Now, I could go through 100 other examples like that, but the pendulum of scholarship has swung back towards the historical reliability of the New Testament. Now, it still may all be lies, it may all be untrue, but you can no longer dismiss it on the grounds that it's obviously fake. It was obviously made up hundreds of years later. And popular culture ought to be aware of this because, as I say, the whole project, the whole cultural project of the last few hundred years rests on propositions which are wrong, very shaky, and at best highly tendentious. And then, of course, there's the way the New Testament just strikes you as a reader. You know, one of the greatest scholars ever to live in Australia was a man named Pierre Ryckmans, wrote under the pen name of Simon Lees, one of the great sinologists, a Belgian. And he wrote he produced an original translation of the Analects of Confucius. And Pierre was a believing Christian. And in his introduction to the Analects of Confucius, he says, of course, there's much more evidence for Jesus than there is for Confucius, but nobody doubts the historicity of Confucius. And nor should you, because of the distinctiveness of Confucius' personality as it comes out through the Analects. But the distinctiveness of Jesus' personality as it comes out through the New Testament is absolutely overpowering. It's inconceivable to imagine that a committee of churchmen made this personality up 200 years later. He says, as a literary man, Pierre was a great literary figure, wonderful novelist, great scholar, wrote mainly in French, but one of the most important sinologists of the 20th century. And he said, as a literary man, I am compelled to believe the New Testament because it is so overwhelmingly has the ring of truth about it. And then, of course, there's also the utter uniqueness of Jesus as a religious figure in history. The thing that struck me about reading the New Testament was not the resurrection, but the death of Jesus. Lots of religious traditions have the idea of one of the polytheistic gods interacting with human beings, not in a historical time, always in a time before history. But, you know, Krishna walked upon the earth and the ancient Greek gods interacted with human beings and so on. And the god is always triumphant, and in any religious tradition you would expect the god to transcend death, to be immortal. But there is no religious tradition in which God himself doesn't sojourn a little while on earth, but becomes a human being and then suffers humiliating death and defeat. And really the most radical thing in the New Testament is not the resurrection of Jesus, but the death of Jesus, the death on Calvary. And of course it is so graphic in the way that it is presented in the Gospels. I find it impossible to believe that it was invented. Now, oddly enough, these two books, you'll find this hard to believe, they did not change the course of Western civilization, even though they had absolutely demonstrated the falsehood of the Disenchantment project. But I do think it is almost beginning to dawn on people that the Disenchantment project leads nowhere and offers nothing. Sadly, it's not leading a return to Christianity, but it's leading to the rise of all kinds of madness. So there was an article in The Economist a few years ago about how belief in God was declining, but belief in the devil was rising. And one day the two graphs would cross over, and the devil would have a wider consensus of belief in Western societies than God does. You know, one of the fastest growing religions in Australia is witchcraft. Every time we try to have religious freedom legislation, we have the devil worshippers claiming their status and so on. Now, I think these are all signs of Western culture, frankly, going mad. And and I'll finish on this point, where I marry my life as a writer of books about Christianity with my conventional life as a foreign editor is on this point. We in the West are faced with tremendously vigorous competitor societies. Russia is doing badly in Ukraine at the moment. The Chinese are vastly more formidable than the Russians, 1,000 times more formidable than the Russians. And they are not suffering the problem of disenchantment. Chinese may well be disenchanted with the Communist Party, but they are not disenchanted with the idea of Chinese hegemony, Chinese power, Chinese destiny, Chinese domination. And the Islamic world is full of purpose, full of energy, full of purpose, while the West is uniquely consumed with a conscious attempt to destroy its own heritage and to label itself wicked and evil and irredeemable. Of course, there are lots of things in Western history that are terrible. That's the human condition. But there are lots of things that are splendid as well. And it's becoming impossible to celebrate the splendid and impossible to inspire the young. Now, I have reached, therefore, a melancholy conclusion, which is that the West cannot survive without Christianity. So conservatives of a certain age are often tempted by this idea. We can have Christian cultural practices and Christian values, but we don't need Christianity. I don't think that's really sustainable in the long run. Ernst Renan remarked, "You can't live forever on the scent of an empty vase." And eventually, if you cut these values, traditions and ideas off from their roots, they will disappear. Universal human rights is not a universally acknowledged proposition in the world. It's a very distinctive proposition that grows out of Christianity within and the Jewish tradition within the West. The ability to sustain our kind of civilization relies on a common acceptance of moral categories which directly come from Christianity, even good and evil itself. And if you completely cut the society off from Christianity, you will destroy that consensus. Of course, individual human beings can lead magnificent lives as atheists or whatever. The human variety is spectacular. But as a society, I don't think a society which comes to hate itself can sustain itself. And I think the evidence that the West is going mad is everywhere. The counter-evidence exists in magnificent institutions like the Danube Institute. Long may it prosper. Thank you.
By the way, I got into a fight with Richard Dawkins, and he came out worse than I did. Thank you, Greg, for those words. They're stark, they're important, and we really are in a major crisis in the West. I fully agree with you that the West is not going to survive without recovering its ancestral religion, and it's also the case that the West cannot survive by having no sense of enchantment. We will be enchanted by something. I think wokeness, for example, is a political sense of enchantment, or in fact, a way of negative enchantment by which we tear down everything that Christian civilization, Judeo-Christian civilization, the civilization of the Bible built. It's also the case that there is a tremendous rise in the occult, as Greg mentioned. I'm fond of telling a story. Well, fond is not quite the right word, but I do tell a story about a young Anglican seminarian I met in Oxford a couple of summers ago who told me that before he went to seminary, he was working in an advertising agency in London, a very powerful one in the creative department, and he said he was the only Christian there, which is not surprising for an ad agency in London. He said, the thing is, there were no atheists there either. Everyone else there was involved with the occult to one degree or the other, including a couple of people who were open Satanists. They defined Satanism as learning to live your best possible life. And he told me that with his generation, he was 27, the new atheist debate is over, and the new atheists have lost, because his generation is not interested in learning to live as atheists. They're interested in anything that gives them a sense of connection to something greater than themselves. The problem is they look to the Christian churches and they don't see that the Christian churches have anything to offer. Unfortunately, I think this is probably right. I'll be going tomorrow to Dublin for the weekend, where three prophetic figures, I believe, rising in the Christian church are speaking. Paul Kingsnorth, who's English, Martin Shaw, also English, and Jonathan Pajot, who is Canadian. These are three young men, all converts to Christianity, indeed Eastern Orthodox Christianity, who are talking about the need for a rewilding of Christianity, a so-called bush Christianity, a Christianity that goes back to the early church and is full of magic and miracle. I say magic not in the occult sense at all, but a Christianity of healings, of miracles, of signs and wonders. This is still there in Christianity. We have to direct people to it and help people to understand that you can still find it there. But it's hard to do it. I'm going to talk a little bit tonight about ways we can do that. What does it mean to say that the modern world, which is to say the Western world, is disenchanted? Can we get enchantment back? Should we want to? Before we talk about that, I'm going to tell you a true story. Years ago, the American linguist Daniel Everett lived with his family deep in the Amazon jungle. He was sent as a Christian missionary to convert the Piraha tribe, a tribe that had been notoriously resistant to the gospel. His goal was to learn the Piraha language, to translate the New Testament into that language, and he hoped lead them to conversion. Well, one morning as Everett and his family slept in their hut by the riverbank, they awoke to the sound of the tribe rushing down to the river. When he and his young daughter followed, they found the excited natives shouting and pointing to the sandy beach 100 yards away. The Pirahas were shouting and pointing at something they called Shigagai. That was their name for a hostile jungle god, a demon who lived in the jungle. The Everetts, that is to say the American missionary and his daughter, they saw nothing. But the natives insisted that Shigagai was actually present, that they were witnessing what theologians call a theophany, a revelation of a god. They couldn't understand, the natives, why the Westerners couldn't see what was obvious to them. Everett wrote later in his memoir of his experience, "What had I just witnessed? Over the more than 2 decades since that summer morning, I have tried to come to grips with the significance of how 2 cultures, my European-based culture and the Piraha's culture, could see reality so differently." Well, Everett eventually left the jungle. He lost his faith and he lost his marriage, and he returned to the United States to teach linguistics. Though he now considers himself an atheist, he is still haunted by what happened on that Amazon beach. Everett is not willing to say that the Pirahas saw an actual demonic jungle god, but he's not willing to say they hallucinated it either. It is a mystery that may never be solved. At the time, Everett was a believing Christian and in some sense lived in an enchanted world, a world in which God exists and God was present. So did the Amazon tribespeople, though they had very different ideas about religion. Now, there's something else interesting about this tribe that has to do with enchantment. Living with that tribe, Everett finally figured out why they could not accept the gospel. In their cultural epistemology, that is, how they determine what is true and what is false, the Pirahas refused to believe anything that was not seen directly by a living person or was not related by a living person who had heard it from another living person. In other words, they couldn't have any concept of history because you had to be alive to say anything true. The idea that events recounted in the Bible or events that may have happened that very day on the other side of the world might be true, that was completely inconceivable to them. The Pirahas were blinded by the mental construct, by the framework that they used to make sense of the world. That is to say, they were incapable of perceiving things that are actually true because of the way they thought about the mind and truth. Now, in that, these Amazon primitives are not so different from us moderns. On the other hand, as the atheist Daniel Everett has the humility to admit, we would be presumptuous to declare that we, with our materialist assumptions, have a more accurate take on reality than the jungle tribe does. What happened on the beach that day in the Amazon frames our discussion of enchantment and re-enchantment as a matter of discerning ultimate reality and establishing a relationship with it. Now, this matters for many, many reasons. Maybe we can talk about the political aspect of it later tonight. But if you read the great book by Tom Holland called Dominion, History of How Christianity Came to Form Western Culture, you will see that liberalism, meaning the thing that we all, liberal values, classical liberal values, are just a secularized version of Christianity. Everything that even people who don't believe in God love about the West, like human rights, things like that, comes out of the Christian religion. And that is to say, it comes from a culture that believes, or once believed, that what the Bible had to say was ultimately true. We don't believe that anymore, generally speaking. I say that we live in a post-Christian culture, not because there are no Christians around. I'm a Christian. Many of us in this room are Christians. But rather because we as a culture in general no longer look to the Bible to tell us the story of who we are. The point is, it matters profoundly first of all, whether enchantment is real and what values and what religion enchant us. Now, for many of us, the word enchantment has to do with a Disney World scenario populated with fairies and sprites and dwarves and all the trappings of fantasy and magic. Or, in a less supernatural way, we call something enchanting when it creates an exceptionally pleasing mood, such as a beautifully decorated parlor at Christmas time. Others think of enchantment as deception, of a spell that charms you to blind you. The early Protestants resisted the idea of enchantment as popish nonsense designed to trick believers and to make them easy to manipulate. Closer to our time, think about the Tennessee Williams character Blanche Dubois from the play and movie A Streetcar Named Desire. She is so desperate to keep those around her from learning her dark secrets that she arranges the lighting in a flattering way and then proclaims, "Look, we have created enchantment." In this sense, enchantment is there to deceive people. In both cases, we associate enchantment with falsehood in either a positive or a negative way. In this view, enchantment distracts us from what is real. It might elevate mundane reality, giving us a cheerful escape from the boring everyday, or it might deceive us by presenting a pleasing lie as a substitute for the ugly truth. But that's not what I mean by enchantment. I'm talking about another older and deeper way to think of enchantment. Enchantment as a revelation of what is truly real. That is, the enchanted world is one in which everything points to God, and that everything we do in some sense involves divinity, a relationship with the divine. The enchanted Christian believes that God is everywhere present, and if he is an Eastern Orthodox Christian, as I am, he also believes that God mystically fills all things with his presence. Now, this is an important distinction to make. It's not enough to just say, I believe in God, and suddenly you live in an enchanted world. Enchantment also has to do with how God relates to the natural world, to the physical world. From the beginning of the Christian faith until roughly the 14th century, all Christians believed that the world of the spirit and the world of matter interpenetrated each other. They took for granted that the cosmos was charged with spiritual force. God wasn't a distant landlord gazing down at creation from his heavenly manor house. For the medieval Christian and his predecessors, says the religion scholar Charles Taylor, God's presence was, quote, an immediate reality, like stones, rivers, and mountains. We think back to the story Greg told about the Coptic Pope, just not even understanding the question about atheism. This is how all Christians were prior to the modern era. That was the enchanted Christian world. Now, it was certainly not the case that the enchanted world was the Garden of Eden. The enchanted world of Christianity was full of suffering, of violence, of all manner of wicked thing. But God was present there in a way that is hard for people today, even for believers, to grasp. As Charles Taylor puts it, for Christians living in the pre-modern world, the world and everything in it was part of a harmonious whole, ordained by God and filled with signs and wonders testifying to God's reality. This fundamental conviction that everything was created by God and existed because of God, that grounded all sense of meaning. The key thing we have to understand is that those Christians did not believe that the world of matter was a blank screen onto which we projected our imagined visions of good and evil. No, meaning was embedded within the world, which, as John's gospel teaches, is the creation of the Logos of Jesus Christ, the second person of the Trinity. Through him all things were made, writes John, and without him nothing was made that has been made. This, for traditional Christians, this means that God is both transcendent, outside of creation, but also immanent through creation. It is a paradox, but this is what traditional Christianity has taught. So the life of Christians then was to live in harmony with that Logos, which existed in all things. The task of Christians included seeking harmony in belief and in deed with the Logos and allowing divine grace to purify them and to draw them closer to participation in God's life. Now, this was not simply a matter of arranging one's thoughts in a particular way, nor was it a matter of behaving in morally correct ways, though both were important. Belief and moral action are absolutely important, but that's not the heart of it. The heart of enchanted Christianity is more than that. It is ultimately concerned with a total transformation of one's soul through unity with Christ. We in the West began to lose touch with enchanted reality around the time of the Renaissance, when, as a culture, our elites took our eyes off of God and focused instead on man. At the dawn of the scientific revolution, Western man made a devil's bargain. He traded meaning for power. He traded meaning for power. That is, he got rid of the traditional metaphysical view grounded in Greek philosophy and Christian teaching that said that the Logos was inherent in the material world. The material world lost its enchantment, or rather, we lost the ability in the West to see the enchantment that is present in the material world. The material world, nature, became nothing but a pile of meaningless stuff. Therefore, our scientists and our masters of technology could do whatever they wanted to do with it. There were no God-ordained limits to what mankind could do to increase his power over nature. We see this today in extreme ways with genetic engineering and with the belief that because the body doesn't mean anything, ultimately, that we can transform the bodies of even children through surgery and chemicals and make them into the opposite sex. This is one of the clearest signs that we live in a disenchanted world, or rather it has been re-enchanted by an alien philosophy and religion. The psychiatrist Ian McGilchrist has a fascinating theory of how the hemispheres of the brain shape culture. The brain's left hemisphere is where its analytical work takes place. It's the part of the brain that takes everything apart to understand how it works. The brain's right hemisphere is where its intuitive work happens. The right hemisphere takes raw sense data and sees it as a whole. In the healthy brain, both left and right hemispheres work together to provide an accurate picture of reality. Ian McGilchrist puts it like this, quote, "You could say, to sum up a vastly complex matter in a phrase, that the brain's left hemisphere is designed to help us apprehend and thus manipulate the world, the right hemisphere to comprehend it, to see it all for what it is." Now, for all of our technological and scientific advances, says McGilchrist, the modern West suffers from a form of mental illness. He tells us that around the time of the scientific revolution, Western man changed the way we saw reality. We leaned very heavily into the left brain way of seeing the world. And we did this because it works to help us increase our power over nature. This is why science and technology exploded in the West as it did in no other civilization. The problem, though, is that we started to believe that the left brain way of seeing the world, the scientific, the analytical way, was the only true way, or rather the truest way of seeing the world. We came to think that the right brain way of knowing, which manifests itself through art, through music, poetry, and religion, was inferior. As a culture and a civilization, we lost the sense of reality that only the right brain can perceive. Now understand what Ian McGilchrist is saying here. He denies that art, music, poetry, and religion are nothing more than aesthetic commentaries on a reality that is accurately perceived by science, mathematics, and analytic philosophy. No, he is saying rather that art, music, poetry, and religion are ways of connecting us with reality that cannot be reached by the left hemisphere. For someone stuck in the left hemisphere, music is just a collection of sounds. But someone who uses their right hemisphere knows that there is a greater meaning there, a meaning that comes out when you consider all of the sounds together in flow. Slowly but steadily, over the last 500 years, we have forgotten this truth, says McGilchrist. The wealthier and more powerful we have become, the more miserable and alienated from ourselves and from the world we have grown. McGilchrist writes, quote, "Indeed, if you had set out to destroy the happiness and stability of a people, it would have been hard to improve on our current formula. Remove yourself as far as possible from the natural world, repudiate the continuity of your culture, believe you are wise enough to do whatever you want, and not only to get away with it, but have a right to do it, and a right to silence those who disagree. Minimize the role played by a common body of belief, actively attack and dismantle every social structure as a potential source of oppression, and reject the idea of a transcendent set of values." Sounds familiar, doesn't it? This is how you disenchant the world. This is how we keep the world disenchanted today. The sickness of the modern West comes from our having cut ourselves off from the source of enchantment, which is to say the belief that all life has ultimate transcendent meaning, grounded in God, the living God, and that we can live in fruitful relationship to that meaning. So how can we recover enchantment? It's not simply a matter of choosing to believe in God. It is certainly possible to believe in God, but to live in a world that is functionally disenchanted. It has a lot to do with how you believe in God. This is because enchantment is not a thing. Enchantment is a way of perceiving the world. If you want to be re-enchanted, and I learned all this because the next book I have coming out is on re-enchantment. So I did a deep dive in the literature of re-enchantment, which took me through psychology, through science, and even through physics and anthropology. If you want to be re-enchanted, you have to surrender the idea that everything can, in principle, be understood and controlled. You have to be willing to be surprised by mystery. You have to live with the idea that you can be called outside of yourself by something that is greater than yourself. Anthropology can teach us something practical about how to find re-enchantment. In the United States, the Stanford University anthropologist T.M. Luhrmann has spent much of her career trying to understand the phenomenology of religious practice. In her 2020 book, How God Becomes Real, Luhrmann, who doesn't take a position on whether or not gods exist, investigates the processes by which religious believers of all kinds come to experience the invisible God as truly present. What does it mean for God to become real? For Luhrmann, it's not really God existing like a building exists, but more along the lines of how a mother's love exists. You can't prove that a mother loves her children, but to deny that a mother's love is real, that's absurd. Yet to know God exists in anything more than an abstract intellectual way, believers must engage in practices that direct their attention toward God in a way that both makes the divine seem more real and that changes the individual believer. Luhrmann writes, quote, "Humans must somehow be brought to a point from which the altar becomes more than gilded wood so that the icon's eyes look back at them ablaze." which is to say that if you want to experience enchantment, then faith must become more than just a collection of theological principles, of moral rules, and of rituals. It must become an experiential means of sharing in the life of God. Well, how do we prepare ourselves to receive that gift of grace? First, believers must have a compelling story that gives them a clear faith frame. You have to know what story you are a part of, because that tells you what you have to pay attention to. Writing about paying attention, Ian McGilchrist says that you need to have some sense of what to look for, or you might miss it. On the other hand, if you have too narrow and precise an idea of what you will permit to enter into your attention, one that excludes too much, you might also miss something that is truly there. Those who want to be faithful, says Tanya Luhrmann, should think with the faith frame as much as they can, despite how easy it can be to get distracted or discouraged, despite the competition from and contradictions of the everyday. That is, to put it plainly, if you want to experience God, you can't just sit around and wait for it to happen. You have to open yourself up to and embrace a set of beliefs and practices that focus the mind towards the world outside your own head, even if that world is unseen. Only that will pull you out of yourself. Second, Luhrmann says that detailed stories help to make gods and spirits feel real. The more concrete and specific the narratives from the Bible, from the lives of saints, and from the stories of other believers, the easier it is for the faith to come alive inside your own imagination. Studies show that the more absorbed people are in faith stories and the more time they spend in prayer, the more likely they are to have these numinous experiences of God's presence. Third, you have to have a faith community. And not just any faith community, but one that shares the same ideas about how God interacts with people and what the rules of engagement are. It also must be a faith community that makes demands on those who join it, that they share the community's vision. This is important because it makes these miraculous experiences shareable. It helps a believer to know that they aren't crazy, that what they are experiencing is real. It is far more likely for the lone individual to grow in the ability to feel God's active presence in her life if she is rooted in a community of believers who can reinforce her experiences. These faithful followers, says the anthropologist, will find their inner lives socialized by others as they accept the rules of the game and remake them as their own. They will become different people as they work with the invisible other, with God, and strive to become the persons they are meant to be in relationship with God. Fourth, talent and training matter. Some people are naturally more spiritually sensitive than others. We all know people who find prayer easier or who seem to have a much thinner veil between themselves and the unseen world. Luhrmann finds that this talent has to do with the ability to focus your attention. People who are able to become absorbed in what they imagine are more likely to have powerful experiences of an invisible other, she writes. And you can train yourself to get better at this. People who practice, she says, this absorption blurs the boundary between the inner world and the outer world, which makes it easier for people to turn to a faith frame to make sense of the world and to experience invisible others as present in a way they feel with their senses. In other words, if you can get yourself into a position when you pray deeply without distraction for a lengthy period of time, you will be able to hear more and more the still small voice of God. To learn how to pray and to worship so that one is drawn into the experience of God involves what Luhrmann calls practices of attention. The way we learn to pay attention not only changes what we notice, but how we experience what we notice, she says. It's not just that people pay attention differently. Instead, what I see is that their attentional patterns can alter something as basic as their perceptual experience. Fifth, the way people think about their minds also matters. In her writing, Tanya Luhrmann contrasts the modern Western view of the self as a citadel, as a fortress, in which the individual lives protected from outside forces, with the older view of the self as participating in the external world, and the external world as participating in their minds and bodies. In other words, the porous self. The standard Western way of thinking about the relationship between the mind and the material world makes it harder for the reality of God to become kindled within ourselves. Faith is in part about a mental disposition. You have to at least be willing to believe that enchantment is possible, or you're never going to experience it. Let me add one more thing before we finish from my own observation and experiences in life. I have known many people who don't believe in God and who have said that if only they experienced a miracle, then they would believe. This is a lie people tell themselves. In fact, what keeps most people from God is not a matter of cognition or experience, but rather a matter of courage. That is, they secretly don't want God to be real because that would mean having to change their lives in ways they don't want to do. There's a story I tell in my forthcoming book about the novelist Tobias Wolff. Back in the early 80s, Wolff was 27 years old. He wasn't really a believer, but he came from a Catholic background. He was working at Lourdes in France, the place where so many people go and experience healing of their sick bodies. He didn't believe in miracles, but he went there because it seemed like a worthy thing to do. His job for that summer was to help sick people get into the water and be bathed and then lift them out. He said that he wore glasses back then. He had very bad eyesight, but he was ashamed to wear glasses because he was young and very vain. So he went around through most of the day with things being blurry. Well, one day he took a young Italian girl, 9 years old, back to her plane. She had been to Lourdes. She was deeply disabled, paralyzed completely. He took her back to the plane to fly back to Italy, and the door of the plane shut before he could get her on. It was hot on the tarmac. He was panicking that they were going to leave without her. He said he started to scream, and he was pounding on the door of the plane, "Let her on, let her on." He said he began to sob over just how pitiful it was, the pathos of this poor sick child suffering like that on a tarmac in France. They finally opened the door. She got onto the plane. He took his handkerchief out. He daubed the sweat and the tears away. I got on a bus to go back to the dorm where the helpers were living. He noticed on his way back that he could see. He wasn't wearing glasses, but his vision was perfect. For the first time since he was a child, his vision was perfect. He had experienced a miracle. He felt an overwhelming desire to go to the grotto at Lourdes to pray, just to thank God for this miracle. But when he got back to the dorm, he saw an Irishman that he was friends with and told him what had happened. The Irishman said, "Oh, yes, it must be a miracle of God." But they went to get a beer, and they kept talking, and they talked, and they talked, and finally it was too late to go to the grotto to thank God. The next morning, Wolff woke up, and he couldn't see again. He told his interviewer years later, recalling this story, he said, "I think deep down, I didn't want to go thank God. I didn't want this miracle because if this was true, what happened to me, I would have to change my life in ways that I didn't want to as a 27-year-old man." So, in fact, he lost his miraculous healing because he didn't want to change. He didn't want to sacrifice his rationalism and the life that he was used to living. This is something important to remember as we think about enchantment. Well, to finish this evening, I would ask, are you brave enough to believe in God? And beyond that, are you brave enough to believe in a God that is beyond your ability to pin down with systematic theology? Not the God of the philosophers, but the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That is the only God who can save the West now. We cannot conjure up re-enchantment, but what we can do is open our eyes and prepare ourselves to see and to feel and to respond to God when he manifests to us. The Harvard philosopher Elaine Scarry defines education not as transferring information from teacher to students, but rather the teacher training her students to be staring at the right corner of the sky when the comet goes blazing past. It's that way with re-enchantment too. We have to look up and get ready to see the comet. The glories of the heaven wheel around us, but we modern people, with our heads buried on our smartphones, keep our faces turned to the earth. And then we wonder, whatever happened to enchantment? Thank you.
Well, first of all, we've heard two extremely powerful and profound talks. I'm going to ask a few questions from both speakers, and then I'm going to turn it over to you, because I think you will have both experiences as well as questions you may want to raise. The first thing I want to suggest is, each question will go to both speakers. Is enchantment a good thing? Obviously, we're assuming it is in the conversation so far, but of course, there may be forms of enchantment which are not. Presumably, there is a demonic enchantment if there is a divine one. And I wonder if you accept that and how you would deal with it. Secondly, presumably, insofar as wokeness is a religion, insofar as Marxism used to be, insofar as humanitarianism, which is a kind of non-Christian, post-Christian residue of Christian virtues, presumably that too has its own, which is in a sense a disenchanted world, but how do we react to that? And I'm, as a Catholic, I have to think that the Catholic Church's attitude to enchantment has been both to believe in it and to attempt to benefit from it, but also to keep it very firmly within limits. And why is that? And is that correct? So I'm going to begin, Greg, with you, and then go on to Rod.
It's working. It's working. You know, you might have been better off if it wasn't working. But look, John, to finish on your last point, I do think that has been the Church's position, but I think that's been a good position historically. Because, you know, one of Chesterton's great insights is that all virtues have to exist in balance with each other, and that great heresies don't start with a lie, they start with a truth held to the exclusion of all other truths. And the Church has always been a little distrustful of undisciplined enthusiasms, and often has a lot of trouble with its own mystics, you know, where it's always excommunicating people who turn out to be saints and so forth. And I think the Church has grown a bit slack in one respect. It makes saints too readily now. I think it seems now like every pope is going to be a saint. I think that's a real pity. I like the idea of it taking hundreds of years to become a saint, and I like a very strong devil's advocate. And the only other point I'd make is that I do believe there is demonic enchantment, absolutely. So, as I say, people believe in the devil quite strongly. They also believe in angels quite strongly. Even as religious belief has declined, angels and devils have remained in popular culture very, very strongly. And I take Pope Francis's advice that you shouldn't ever talk to the devil. But Francis himself is always talking about the devil. You know, Francis is a difficult pope for a conservative, but he certainly lives in a metaphysical universe himself. And so the point I'm making very clumsily is there is a divine balance. I mean, I don't know why I'm quoting Chesterton all the time tonight, but remember that great line from Orthodoxy, the truth is like a wild chariot, reeling from left to right, but never quite toppling over, the wild truth, reeling but erect. So you want the enchantment of Lourdes and the miraculous. You want to be open to the miraculous. All Christians believe in miracle cures. At the same time, you want to be distrustful of charlatanry and so forth. And I think Catholics have a great advantage because they can leave a lot of things up to the judgment of the Church, which is no bad thing. You know, I'm quite happy to say that's above my pay grade, but the Church teaches X, Y, Z.
When you are not, of course, anymore a Catholic, you're now an Orthodox Christian. Maybe you have a different response.
No, I don't. I think Greg is right that we have to allow for the reality of the enchanted world, but we also can't be too credulous about it. In the Orthodox world, we have a word called prelest, which means deception, spiritual deception. And you're always told as a Christian, as an Orthodox Christian, to submit any numinous experience, any allegedly miraculous experience to spiritual judgment, to discernment, because it could be something demonic or it could be just something in your head. One thing I do want to point out, though, and this is something that is a sign of the times we're in, is in my book about re-enchantment that I'm working on, I interviewed exorcists for this book, both Catholic and Orthodox, And they say that there is a staggering rise in the number of exorcisms in the world and demand for exorcists in our current time. People are seeking out enchantment with no sense of guidance. Whether it's fooling with Ouija boards or taking psychedelic drugs, getting involved with witchcraft, things like that, they are opening up doors that should not be opened. One of the people I interviewed for the book is a former occultist who became a Christian. He's also a scholar of comparative religion in one of the best departments in the U.S. And he said that he went down a road into demon worship and near insanity because of curiosity. He was a suburban evangelical who was bored and thought there surely must be more to religious experience than the sort of, greeting card evangelicalism. This ended up, his curiosity and his being dazzled by enchantment, being dazzled by the woo-woo, ended up with him becoming very nearly possessed. The idea is you should not make seeking enchantment your goal. If enchantment comes to you by seeking the truth, well and good for you. But if you seek enchantment in the spiritual fireworks, it's very easy to be misled. As an exorcist in the Vatican told me, the thing is, if you call on the devil and his servants, they will come. And we have to be extremely careful with that.
Let me now turn to the question of the two sides of the brain. And the great advantage, it seems to me, of it's the right-hand side, the side of everyday prudential reasoning. The great advantage of that is when you're trying to argue a case or perceive a truth, that side of the brain and the doctrines that come from that offer you an easy way. They offer you a series of tests. I mean, science is a question of testing theories against experiments. What are and that's obviously a huge advantage. For the work to understand and have a better understanding of the world which is enchanted, what are the kind of tests that the left-hand side of the brain would offer us? I mean, how do we deal with the fact that music is obviously very powerful in our lives, particularly when we open ourselves to it, and yet it's not clear to what truths it is leading. It's not clear how I would interrogate music or art in quite the way that I can interrogate science or economics.
Well, Dr. McGilchrist has a very complex theory of this, and I would surely get it wrong if I tried to speak for him. But he's saying that all truth is not propositional. That the truth of a mother's love. He talks about how good architecture conveys to us truths about the way the world is constructed that cannot be necessarily reduced to a proposition, but we can nevertheless apprehend it with our intuitive faculties. And that's Kierkegaard put it like this, and I think this is a good way to understand it. Kierkegaard said that truth is subjective. Well, truth is subjectivity. He didn't mean that all truth is relative. He meant that the kind of truths for which a man lives and dies are truths that can only be approached subjectively, with the heart. 2 + 2 = 4 is something we can know objectively, but nobody lives and dies for that. God exists is something that might be objectively true, but we can only really know it subjectively, which is to say, through the right brain.
Thank you. Craig?
Well, I profoundly agree with Rod on this, but I think Roger's scrutiny is tremendously enlightening on this subject. Nobody lives their life as a hyper-rationalist, and hyper-rationality is in fact irrational. If you try to make everything rational, you will get to irrational conclusions because rationality itself can't apprehend the truth. So the most important decisions in your life are not irrational, but they're not primarily rational. Like you get married and you fall in love. And, there are dating apps that try to reduce this to some sort of scientific formula. But, you marry someone beautiful like JC and you just think 30 years later, what an act of mercy from God that was. But how could I explain it rationally? Of course I can't explain it rationally, but I don't live my life with that. You live it rationally, but you don't live it by hyper-rationalism. Almost everything you believe in normal life is not proven. It's rational, but it's not proven. I believe I'm the son of my late parents. I really have no proof of the matter. I never took a DNA test. I never even investigated my birth. They might be telling me lies. But you mainly live your life by faith. And faith, of course, is a question of who you believe, not what you believe. And this is absolutely the normal human way of life. And yet there's a cult now of hyper-rationalism, which, of course, leads you to crackers conclusions. You know, you end up with teaching 7-year-olds that they're not boys, they're really girls in disguise and so on. And hyper-rationalism just goes completely crazy if it's not tempered by human intuition.
John, can I give you one quick
yes.
example about how some truths can only be apprehended or better apprehended with the right brain? Back in 2012, I was suffering a terrible health crisis, chronic fatigue. I was related to an emotional and a psychological fight within my family. I had to try to find healing, and I went to see a therapist at my wife's insistence, and I had all my defenses lined up against the therapist. I could tell what he was saying made sense, but I was too smart for the therapist. At the same time, I started reading The Divine Comedy by Dante, and that experience of that book absolutely changed me, and it helped me resolve my internal problems, and I became physically healed. When it was all over, I was able to understand that the things I got out of reading this poem, this story, this beautiful poem, they were the same truths that this therapist was trying to tell me, but they were presented in a narrative that was in beautiful language, and that made it sink in. I came to find out, I wrote a book about this, and I found out that neuroscientists have shown that when people, they had an experiment where they gave people a set of propositions that were moral nonfiction propositions, tested their brains when they read them, and then they gave them a short story that enacted all of these moral propositions, but they embodied them in characters and story. Their brains reacted much differently to the story and much more deeply. This is just it doesn't have to you don't have to bring religion into it at all. This is a scientific explanation of how certain truths become more apprehensible and can change us if they are presented in poetry, art, or music.
I want to move on to questions, but I'm going to have a quick one. So can you both, three of us are Christians, are believers. We all have dear friends who are what I would call cultural Christians and who value this. Some, I'm thinking, close friends you and I have both gotten, and you and I. And yet, so how would we talk to them to, in a sense, open them up to belief? Particularly those cases of Christians who used to be devout Christians and have abandoned it. It seems to me that, in a sense, how can any individual have the doors of perception to an enchanted world opened for them in a way that is not dangerous?
Well, John, I must say, I find it astounding that anyone would come to Christianity through me. And it just shows how broad-minded God is, that he even allows a News Corp journalist to talk about God without just striking him down, on the spot. But I say with all astonishment that quite a lot of people have come to me after my book and said, that brought me back to the church, or that rekindled my belief. A wonderful man, Jim Molan, senator we had, just died recently of cancer. Truly a wonderful, wonderful man. Had been our most senior general in the Iraq War and so on. Brought up a Catholic, left his practice long since behind. He said to me after reading the book Christians, he said, that book made me think a lot, and I've started to pray again. And I've come to the view that if even a spectacularly unsuccessful Christian like me can have that effect, the thing is so one of the reasons I write these books is to get Christians just to be straightforward about what they believe. Most of the time we're kind of too embarrassed You know, over the years, over the decades, it was vaguely known that I was more or less vaguely Christian. And politicians, you know, journalists spend their lives swimming in the pool with politicians. Some politicians would come to talk to me about Christianity, and I'd always deflect. You know, I was careful and just play a dead bat and, you know, put the ball away and get back to politics, because I was kind of embarrassed about having the conversation, even though in a sense I was the one who'd raised it publicly. But I just say to Christians, if you just speak honestly about what you believe, nothing is more powerful than the simple testimony. And of course, nothing is more damaging than simple hypocrisy. So if you then, you know, return home and beat your wife or something, well, you know, you've just done an enormous, or, you know, in the case we're all familiar with, if you're a priest and you go and abuse children, you've just done the worst thing, not only to the children, but to the church that any human being could do.
Well, one of the greatest Christians of our era, Pope Benedict XVI, Cardinal Ratzinger, said something very wise on this point. He said that the greatest arguments the church has for itself are not propositional arguments, not apologetics arguments. Those are important, but they're not the most important thing. Rather, the most important arguments for the faith are the art the church produces and the saints the church produces. What he meant by that was that in an age, in a post-rational era, when arguments don't matter to people, if you make the faith incarnate and accessible through art, architecture, music, things like that, you testify to God's reality through art, or in the lives of saints, men and women who have lived heroic lives for the faith. Those are the things that will move people's hearts and cause them to open their minds to these arguments. Now, when I read that 15 years ago, I realized that's how I came to faith. It wasn't through argumentation. It was, first of all, when I was 17, walking to the Cathedral of Chartres in France. I was absolutely overwhelmed by the glory of God made manifest in that church. I had no experience of anything like that growing up in small-town America, the late 20th century. And then that put me on a journey to faith. And then 8 or 9 years later, meeting an elderly Catholic Monsignor in a nursing home in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, a man who had had 2 miraculous experiences that caused him to leave his very successful life as a professor of art and an artist to serve God humbly as a priest. And that old man, who was saintly and who just radiated light and goodness, when he talked about what happened to him 50 years ago in a church in Guatemala, he was crying. And he convinced me as a 24-year-old young man who was drawn to God but was afraid to commit to God, because what if it's wrong? What if I make a sacrifice and God doesn't exist? Hearing that saint testify to the miracles he experienced, that was the final thing that made me take a step into the church.
And now let us thank you. And now let us have questions from the floor.
We have 7.5 minutes.
We only have 7 minutes, so
quick questions, quick.
Yes, gentleman here.
Hey, so I'm from Australia, and one thing I notice in Australia in terms of both religion and politics is we have the issue where conservative politicians, we have the Liberal Party in Victoria as our conservative party, and talking to actual members of Parliament, they're all afraid to state their conservative views because they have this weird idea where if they start leaning to the left, they're more likely to get the popular vote. And then they say, well, once we get elected, then we can talk about our conservative views, but until then we can't. And talking to Christian leaders in Australia as well, I hear a similar thing. It's like, well, you know, yes, I'm a devout Christian, I believe in God and so on, but I feel if I talk to my congregation and say that, you know, we don't accept gay marriage, for example, I feel, well, that will turn the congregation away and we'll lose more people to God rather than get more. And I kind of see that all over society in Australia. But then, as was mentioned earlier, in, for example, Islam, they just say what they believe and people feel they've got their belief, they've got their leadership, and it seems to be growing rather than shrinking because they have the courage to state their beliefs, whether you agree with them or not. Is that an issue with Christianity and conservatism in general, that unwillingness to simply stand ground and say, this is what we believe, accept it or not?
Sure. Look, I think you're absolutely right. But it's fascinating. In Europe, most of the traditional conservative parties have kind of died, and they've been replaced by what used to be called far-right parties, which have become, which have rejected now their previous extremism and become real conservative parties. And you see Giorgia Meloni, I'm an Italian, I'm a Catholic, I'm a woman. Let me state this quite clear. I don't exist on a gender continuity point. And certainly the state Liberal parties in Australia are the worst, most feeble, most unspeakably unsuccessful, decadent, useless, banal, basically incompetent, hollow, meaningless parties in the history of the world. I would vote for a communist before I'd vote for the Victorian Liberal Party, because at least the communist would be telling me what he really believes. And but they are, they're heading for the ash can of history. But on the other hand, the movements in Christianity which are succeeding have very clear messages, very strong leadership, very clear beliefs, and generally beautiful liturgy. So they lead people to truth through beauty. And that beautiful liturgy can be Gregorian chant, Latin Mass, or it can be fabulous, brilliantly rendered rock songs at Pentecostal churches. If I paid $100 to go to a rock concert and it was as good as Planet Shakers in Melbourne, I wouldn't think I'd wasted my money. So, in the end, victory will go to the brave, and cowards absolutely guarantee their own defeat in time.
That's 100% true. I couldn't say it better. I've noticed in the United States, COVID has really been an important dividing line within the churches. In the little Orthodox parish I went to in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, we really began to grow after COVID. And we began getting all these young converts. They were people aged 30 and under, many of them evangelical, a few Catholics, most evangelical. We were happy to see them, but we're like, why are you here? Welcome, but why? They all had, one way or the other, the same story, that we could tell that things are going to go very badly for Christians in this society. This is a post-Christian society. We want to be part of a church and to be formed by a religion that has staying power, that knows how to suffer, and that is not going to go anywhere. It's not going to go with the winds. And this is really powerful. Now, I'm not going to say that all Orthodox priests are brave. They aren't. You have many who are terrified to speak the truth because they want to be liked. But as Greg said, the future is going to belong to church leaders who are willing to speak the truth, and more than willing to speak the truth, willing to suffer for their faith, to show by the suffering in their body what is true.
We have enough time for one very quick question and two very quick responses, preferably quotes from Chesterton. Last question.
I'm reminded when you mentioned that economist statistics about people who are declining of belief in God and increase in worshiping the devil. Popular culture has surprisingly been unrestricted in welcoming devil worship in their ranks. I'm reminded of that Grammy show with Sam Smith and Kim Petras. And last year, there's this one music video where Lil Nas X pictures himself descending to hell and pole dancing with the devil or something. I don't know. And I'm reminded of that Milton.
This is turning into a long question. You must be quick.
The appeal is that it is better to rule in hell than to serve in heaven. Is that what you believe?
I'll just repeat that. It is the appeal of the devil that on the grounds that it is better to rule in hell than to serve in heaven, which I think is a quote from Milton. First of all, Rob.
The devil has all the best rock songs. I think when you're younger, the idea of rebellion is very, very appealing. The thing is, today, if you want to be truly rebellious, you should become a Christian, and indeed one of the traditional Christians.
I will restrict myself to 1 minute, but, I really admire Fidel Castro for his 8 and 9 hour speeches, and I've always tried to emulate that. I would just say to you, there's a lot more Christian culture than you would think. When I wrote God is Good for You, the chapter I had most fun with was inserting Christ into popular culture. And I was astonished how successful Christian culture is in the popular marketplace when you get it in there. So this wonderful TV series, Jane the Virgin, it's full of madness in a way, but it positively affirms Latin American or Hispanic Catholicism, and Jane decides to remain a virgin until she's married, and the series affirms this choice as a positive life choice for her. The other thing is, that wonderful Joan Robinson who won the Pulitzer Prize with Gilead. Now, this is a book about a Congregationalist minister in 1956 who's very conservative, who's going to vote for Eisenhower and spends half the book contemplating heaven, and it won the Pulitzer Prize. Then you look at that series, The Chosen, crowd-funded, self-funded, watched by 70 million people, about the gospel and the people in the gospel. I mean, I really think we can do it. It's just a matter of you've got to try, I mean, you won't win the lottery if you don't buy a ticket. I think you can get Christ into the popular culture. And I don't think the devil is always that popular, but he's always present. But as I say to you, angels are always very popular too. Remember I must finish, but remember the bishop's wife, Cary Grant, was the angel. He was the most glamorous guy on the planet. You can't get, and then meet Joe Black. Who do we get? That movie star, what's his name? Who was it? Brad Pitt. He's an angel. I mean, that's pretty good PR. The angels are doing very well in Hollywood, Cary Grant and Brad Pitt, and they had Michael Landon in Highway to Heaven. They're doing okay, Don't count the angels
We
out.
have to wind up. I think
She'll break your arm like she broke mine.
It's because of the translator.
It's because of... Yes. Thank you very much indeed, gentlemen. Thank you very much, members of the audience. I think we've had a profoundly interesting occasion, which opens up, of course, a lot of other questions for other occasions to answer. So on your behalf...